April 17th, 1945, a frozen rail yard outside Munich. The morning air cut like broken glass. Margaret Hartwell had been chained to a metal support bar for 5 days. No food, no water, no mercy. The Nazi officer who locked her there said she deserved it. Her crime telling fellow Germans the war was lost, that they should surrender. For that simple truth, she was shackled like an animal inside a cattle car and left to die in the cold. 23 women were trapped with her, all of them waiting for death. Or worse, the Americans. The propaganda had been clear, relentless everywhere. Americans torture prisoners. Americans show no mercy. Americans are savages in uniform animals who would do unspeakable things to captured German women. Every radio broadcast, every poster, every whispered warning said the same thing: better to die than fall into American hands. So when Staff Sergeant Thomas Mitchell pulled open that rusted cattle car door, Margaret Hartwell expected a monster. Instead, he set down his rifle, crouched to her level, looked into her hollow, sunken eyes, and asked one simple question that would shatter everything she had been taught to believe. That question broke her, not with pain, not with fear, but with something she never expected from the enemy: kindness. What did he ask? And why did 3 simple words change her life forever? Stay with me. This story will restore your faith in humanity. If you love untold stories of mercy in our darkest hours, please subscribe to this channel, hit the like button, and watch until the end, because what happens next proves that even in war, compassion can triumph over hatred. The rail yard had no name anymore. Whatever the Germans had called it, some bureaucratic designation stamped on schedules and freight manifests, was gone now, erased by the same artillery that had cratered the switching station and twisted the signal towers into abstract sculptures of bent iron. By April 17th, 1945, it was just another wound in the landscape, another scar left behind as the Third Reich bled out across Bavaria. Staff Sergeant Thomas Mitchell's patrol reached the yard at 10:40 hours. 12 men, tired, cold, their boots crunching on frost that still clung to the gravel despite the weak morning sun. They had been walking since before dawn, following rail lines eastward, part of the massive cleanup operation that trailed behind General Patton's Third Army like a broom sweeping up the debris of conquest. The fighting had moved on. What remained was the sorting, the cataloguing, checking what the retreating Wehrmacht had abandoned in their desperate haste to escape the closing American pincers. Mitchell was 28 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with a weathered face that made him look older. He came from Tuscaloosa, Alabama, from a family of tobacco farmers who knew hard work and harder winters. He had been drafted in 1942, had seen 3 years of war across North Africa, Sicily, France, and now Germany. He carried his grief quietly, the way his father had taught him to carry everything. His younger brother David had died at the Battle of the Bulge just 4 months earlier, frozen in the snow at Bastogne, killed by German artillery. Every instinct told Mitchell these people were the enemy, but his father's voice was stronger than instinct. Tommy, his father had said once, leaning against a fence post at sunset, "Meanness ain't the same as strength. Any fool can be cruel. Takes a man to be merciful." "Standard procedure," Mitchell said, his Alabama drawl soft but carrying across the cold morning air. "Check every building, every boxcar, every cellar. Look for hidden weapons intelligence documents, stragglers who haven't gotten the message that the war is over for them. 2 men per car. Anything unusual you call out." The statistics of collapse surrounded them. In the final months of the war, the German rail network had moved over 400,000 troops and countless tons of material in desperate, futile attempts to reinforce crumbling fronts. Now those same rails carried nothing. Locomotives sat cold and dead. Freight cars stood abandoned, their contents spilling onto the ground. Crates of machine parts, medical supplies, boxes of paperwork that would never reach their destinations. The smell hit them first. Oil and rust, wet ash, something organic underneath that nobody wanted to identify. Private Danny Whitfield, barely 20 years old and still uncomfortable in a helmet that looked borrowed from an older brother, gagged and turned away. The older men said nothing. They had learned to breathe through their mouths. Cars 1 through 6 yielded nothing remarkable. Empty. Abandoned. Some had their doors hanging open like slack jaws. Others contained mundane cargo. Crates of ammunition with no guns to fire them. Medical bandages that would never wrap wounds. Stacks of Wehrmacht uniforms still wrapped in paper waiting for soldiers who would never wear them. Then they reached the 7th car. Private First Class Roberto Castillo tried the door and found it locked. Not just closed, chained. Heavy links wrapped around the exterior handles, secured with a padlock that gleamed dully in the grey morning light. Sergeant Castillo called out, "Got something here?" Mitchell walked over his rifle, hanging easy at his side. He examined the chain, ran a finger along the cold metal. His brow furrowed. Why would someone chain a cargo car from the outside? He murmured, more to himself than anyone else. Castillo shrugged. Keep something in, maybe. Or keep us out. Mitchell stood there for a long moment, studying the sealed door. In 3 years of war, he had learned to read situations the way his father had taught him to read weather back in Alabama. The way clouds gathered before a storm. The way stillness in the air meant something was coming. This felt wrong. The Wehrmacht abandoned equipment all the time now. They left tanks, artillery pieces, entire motor pools. But they did not lock things up and throw away the key, not unless they were hiding something or leaving something to die. "Cut it," Mitchell said quietly. Castillo pulled bolt cutters from his pack. The chain snapped with a metallic crack that echoed across the empty yard, sharp as a rifle shot. Birds scattered from a nearby roofline, their wings beating against the silence. Mitchell gripped the door handle. The metal was ice cold, burning his palm, even through his gloves. He pulled. The door slid open with a grinding screech of rusted wheels, and morning light flooded into the darkness within. The smell that poured out made Castillo step back, one hand covering his nose. Not death, thank God, not death, but something almost as terrible. Unwashed bodies, human waste, sickness and fear given solid form. And then, as Mitchell's eyes adjusted to the shadows, he saw them. Shapes, human shapes. Women huddled against the wooden walls, wrapped in torn blankets, staring at him with eyes that expected the worst. But one woman was not huddled with the others. One woman was chained to a metal support bar in the center of the car, her wrists shackled, her body frozen in a crouch that spoke of days without relief, and she was looking directly at him. The cattle car was freezing. No insulation, just wooden walls and a metal roof. Frost covered the inside corners. The women's breath came out in white clouds. Mitchell counted them quickly. 23 women. Most wore torn Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms, the grey-green of nurses, clerks, radio operators. Some had blankets wrapped around their shoulders. Others just sat in the dirty straw that covered the floor, staring at nothing. In one corner sat a bucket. That was their toilet. The smell came from there. But Mitchell's eyes kept returning to the woman in the center. She was young, maybe mid-20s. Her nurse's uniform was filthy torn at the shoulder, stained with blood. Whether hers or someone else's, he could not tell. Her dark blonde hair hung in matted strands around her face. Dirt streaked her cheeks. Metal shackles bound both wrists. A short chain connected them to the vertical support bar. The chain was too short for her to stand up fully, too short to sit down completely. She was stuck in a half-crouch, her legs trembling from exhaustion. When the door opened and light poured in, the women reacted differently. Some covered their faces as if expecting to be hit. Others just stared, too tired to care. A few whispered to each other in German, their voices barely audible. The chained woman looked up at Mitchell. Her eyes were dark, sunken from lack of sleep and food, but they were not empty. Fear lived there, yes, but also something else. A kind of stubborn defiance. She expected the worst. She had been told what Americans did to prisoners, especially women. The Nazi propaganda had been relentless. By 1945, Joseph Goebbels' ministry was broadcasting warnings 24 hours a day. Americans would torture captured Germans, rape the women, leave them to die in ditches. Better to take cyanide than surrender to the Allies. This woman had believed those warnings. Every German had heard them, seen the posters, listened to the radio broadcasts. Now here she was, chained like an animal, and the enemy had found her. She braced herself for what came next. Mitchell stood in the doorway. Behind him, Castillo and the others waited, watching. The sergeant was tall, broad-shouldered, his face weathered by 3 years of war. He had seen too much. Dead soldiers in frozen foxholes, destroyed cities, refugees walking in endless columns with everything they owned on their backs. But this was different. This was deliberate cruelty. Germans doing this to other Germans. He looked at the chained woman for a long moment. She looked back, waiting. Her breathing was shallow, rapid, her whole body tensed, ready for pain. Then Mitchell did something nobody expected. He lowered his rifle, set it carefully against the doorframe, stepped inside the car, slowly, carefully, like approaching a wounded animal that might bolt. He stopped a few feet from her, crouched down to her eye level, and in simple, clear English, knowing she probably would not understand all the words, but hoping his tone would carry the meaning, he asked, "When did you last eat?" The question hung in the cold air. Not who are you, not why are you chained, not where are your commanders. Just simple human concern about her basic welfare. When did you last eat? The woman stared at him. Her name was Margaret Hartwell, though Mitchell did not know that yet. She was 23 years old, the daughter of a baker from a small town outside Stuttgart. She had trained as a nurse before the war, worked in a civilian hospital until 1943, when the Wehrmacht conscripted all available medical personnel. She had spent 2 years treating wounded soldiers, first in field hospitals near the Eastern Front, then in Germany itself as the Allies closed in. When the Reich collapsed, she tried to go home, but the roads were chaos, refugees everywhere, soldiers retreating, SS still executing deserters. Military police had picked her up, accused her of desertion, thrown her into that cattle car with the other women. The officer in charge had chained her specifically because she had argued they should surrender instead of running. That defiance had earned her 5 days of suffering. Margaret's lips trembled. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. She had been preparing herself for cruelty, built mental walls. The propaganda had trained her exactly what to expect from American beasts. But this question, this simple kindness, completely demolished those walls. Tears began streaming down her dirty face. Her shoulders shook. She tried to speak, tried to answer, but all that came out was a sob, then another. Then she was crying openly, uncontrollably. All the fear and pain and exhaustion of the past 5 days pouring out in broken sobs. Mitchell did not move. He just stayed there, waiting. His face was calm, patient, not threatening. Behind him, Castillo shifted uncomfortably. This was not what any of them expected to find today. The other women in the car watched in silence. Some started crying too, not from fear anymore, from something else. Confusion, maybe. Disbelief. This was not the enemy they had been promised. After several long minutes, Margaret's crying subsided. She was still trembling, but she had regained some control. She looked at Mitchell through tear-blurred eyes. He was still there, still waiting, still looking at her like she was a person. Not an enemy, not a problem, just a person who deserved basic care. Mitchell stood up slowly, turned to his men. "Castillo, get the bolt cutters," he said quietly. "And someone radio back to command. Tell them we need medical personnel here, multiple civilian prisoners, at least one in bad shape." He looked back at Margaret. "We're going to get you out of those chains." She did not understand the words, but she understood the tone. For the first time in 5 days, something other than fear entered her heart. Hope. Castillo moved forward with the bolt cutters. Margaret flinched when he approached. Her body went rigid. Mitchell held up his hand in a calming gesture. "It's okay," he said softly. "We're going to help you." She did not understand the words, but his tone was gentle. His movements were slow, careful, not threatening. Castillo positioned the bolt cutters around the chain connecting her shackles to the metal bar. He was careful not to touch her wrists. The blacksmith's son from El Paso had worked with metal his whole life. He knew how to cut without causing harm. One squeeze. The chain snapped. Suddenly Margaret could move. After 5 days locked in that half-crouch position, she could finally sit down properly. Her legs gave out immediately. She collapsed to the floor of the cattle car, unable to stand. The shackles were still on her wrists, connected by a short length of chain, but at least she was not bound to the bar anymore. She sat there, shaking, not from cold, from release. Mitchell pulled a canteen from his belt. He unscrewed the cap and held it out to her. "Water," he said, gesturing to his mouth. "Drink." She stared at the canteen like it was a miracle. Her hand, shaking badly, reached out and took it. The metal was warm from being against his body. After 5 days of ice-cold metal shackles pressing into her flesh, this warmth was a shock. This small kindness carried more weight than any words could. She brought the canteen to her lips. The water was the most beautiful thing she had ever tasted. She drank carefully, not frantically. Her body knew better than to drink too fast after days without water. But each swallow felt like life returning. She lowered the canteen after a few swallows and looked at Mitchell again. Something different was in her eyes now. Not just fear. Something else. Confusion. Disbelief. This was not supposed to happen. While this happened, other soldiers were helping the rest of the women out of the cattle car. Most could walk, though they moved slowly, stiffly. Their bodies were cramped from days of sitting in the cold. Private Whitfield extended his hand to an older woman near the door. She stared at it for a long moment as if trying to understand what this gesture meant. Then, tentatively, she took it. Her name was Ingrid Fisher. She was 44 years old, the oldest woman in the cattle car. Back home she had 4 sons. All of them conscripted into the Wehrmacht. All of them missing now, swallowed by the war machine that had consumed an entire generation. She needed support to walk. 2 soldiers helped her down, one on each side, moving with practiced care. She kept whispering the same phrase over and over in German, her voice cracked and hoarse. "Sie helfen uns tatsächlich." They are actually helping us. The words came out like a prayer, like something she needed to say out loud to make it real. Because nothing about this matched what she had been told. The Americans were supposed to be monsters, but these men moved with gentleness, with respect. Near the back of the cattle car sat Clara Zimmermann, 19 years old, the youngest of them all. She had grown up in the Hitler Youth, had believed every word they told her about the superiority of the Reich, about the barbarism of their enemies. Even now, even after 5 days in this frozen hell, part of her still clung to those beliefs. When a young American soldier approached her, she pulled away, covering her face with her hands. "Please," she whispered in German, "please do not hurt me." The soldier stopped. He did not understand her words, but he understood her fear. He took a step back, giving her space. Then he simply held out his hand, palm up, and waited. His face was patient, kind even. He could not have been much older than she was. Clara watched him, watched his hand extended but not demanding, watched his face which showed no anger, no threat, no cruelty. The propaganda had shown her images of American soldiers as savage beasts. But this boy, because that is what he was, just a boy in a uniform, looked tired, sad, human. Slowly, so slowly, she lowered her hands. Then she reached out and took his hand. He helped her stand, helped her down from the cattle car, and when her legs wobbled, he steadied her. He did not touch her beyond what was necessary, did not leer, did not threaten, just helped. And something inside Clara Zimmermann began to crack. Helena Werner, another nurse like Margaret, had collapsed from dehydration hours earlier. She lay in the straw, barely conscious, her lips cracked and bleeding. 2 soldiers assessed her quickly, then made a stretcher from a blanket. They lifted her with practiced efficiency, the kind that came from carrying wounded men off battlefields. They carried her out gently, as if she were made of glass. Within an hour, medical personnel arrived. A jeep pulled up to the rail yard, and Captain Sarah Bennett stepped out. She was 36 years old, from Richmond, Virginia, a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes and sharper instincts. She had seen her share of casualties in field hospitals across France and Germany. She had patched up soldiers with missing limbs, treated men with shell shock so severe they could not speak, held the hands of boys who died crying for their mothers. But even she paused when she saw the state of these prisoners. "Jesus Christ," she muttered under her breath. Then louder, snapping into command mode. "Okay, let us get them sorted. Anyone unconscious or unable to walk over here? Everyone else, we are doing basic medical checks." The German women were terrified of her at first. They did not understand English commands. They assumed the worst because what else could they assume? A woman in authority, barking orders in the enemy's language. But Captain Bennett had dealt with frightened civilians before. She knew how fear looked, how it smelled. She moved slowly, spoke softly, made sure to show them everything she was doing. A thermometer was not a weapon. A stethoscope was not a torture device. Just medical equipment. Just tools to help. She crouched beside Margaret. The visual echo was not lost on Margaret, this repetition of someone lowering themselves to her level instead of towering over her. Bennett saw the shackles, immediately saw the raw, bleeding wounds underneath. "We need to get those off," she said, looking up at Castillo. "Can you cut them?" "Yes, ma'am," Castillo replied, but carefully. Her wrists are torn up. The shackles had cut deep into Margaret's wrists. 5 days of metal grinding against flesh with no relief had left wounds that were raw, bleeding in places, infected in others. These were wounds that would scar, permanent marks that Margaret would carry for the rest of her life, reminders written in scar tissue of what her own people had done to her. Captain Bennett cleaned the wounds as gently as possible. Margaret still winced at every touch, her body flinching from pain that had become constant expected. It took Castillo 15 minutes to carefully cut through the shackles without causing more damage. He worked slowly, methodically, his hands steady. When the metal finally fell away with a dull thud onto the cattle car floor, Margaret just stared at her freed wrists. She rubbed them gently, feeling the absence of weight, the absence of restraint. Her skin was raw and torn, but her hands were free. Free to move, free to touch her own face, free to simply exist without constant pain. Fresh tears rolled down her cheeks, but she did not make a sound this time. Just silent tears, tracking through the dirt on her face. "Who does this to their own people?" Captain Bennett muttered to Mitchell, her voice low but hard with anger. Mitchell had no answer. He had seen a lot in this war, But this was different. This was not the heat of battle, not the fog of war. This was calculated, deliberate, punishment meted out by officers to their own soldiers for the crime of speaking truth. By noon, food arrived. The army field kitchen had prepared hot soup, bread, canned vegetables. Nothing fancy, nothing elegant, but it was hot and it was plentiful. The German women were gathered in a cleared area near the rail yard, sitting on blankets soldiers had laid out on the cold ground. They watched with wide eyes, with expressions that mixed disbelief and desperate hunger as metal cups of soup were distributed. The smell of food was overwhelming. It hit them like a physical force, triggering responses in bodies that had been shutting down from starvation. According to military reports, the average German civilian ration in April 1945 was down to 1,000 calories per day. Many were getting far less. Cities were starving, villages were empty, and these women had not eaten in 4 days. Margaret watched as Mitchell approached her with a metal cup. Steam rose from it, curling in the cold air. She was sitting apart from the others, still looking dazed, still trying to process everything that had happened in the last few hours. From expecting torture to receiving kindness. From chains to freedom. From dying to living. Mitchell held out the soup. She did not take it at first. She just stared at it, then at him, searching his face for the trick. What did he want in return? What would this kindness cost her? "It is okay," Mitchell said gently. "Just soup. You need to eat." His voice was soft, his Alabama drawl making the words sound almost musical. He held the cup steady, waiting, not forcing, just offering. Finally, with shaking hands, Margaret took the cup. It was warm, not hot enough to burn, but warm enough to feel like life itself flowing into her palms. The first warm thing she had held in days. She lifted it to her lips and sipped. The soup was thin, mostly broth, with some vegetables and bits of meat. Nothing special. The kind of simple fare that soldiers ate every day without thinking about it. But to Margaret Hartwell it was the best thing she had ever tasted. Better than her father's fresh-baked bread on Sunday mornings. Better than her mother's Christmas dinner. Better than anything, because it was not just food. It was proof that she would live, that the nightmare was over. She drank slowly at first, then faster. She had to force herself to slow down again. Her stomach, empty for so long, rebelled at the sudden intake. She felt nauseous, but she kept drinking. She needed this, needed the calories, needed the warmth, needed the simple, undeniable reality that she was being fed. Around her, the other women were having similar experiences. Some cried as they ate. Others laughed, short, desperate bursts of sound that came from relief and disbelief mixing together. Everything they had been told was a lie. Every warning, every broadcast, every poster showing Americans as savage beasts, all of it was propaganda built on nothing. The Americans were not animals. They were just men. Men who gave water to the thirsty and food to the hungry. Men who treated prisoners like human beings instead of enemies to be destroyed. And that truth was harder to accept than any cruelty would have been. Because if they had lied about this, what else had been lies? What else had they believed that was false? The questions opened up like chasms, threatening to swallow everything these women had understood about the world. By late afternoon, arrangements were made. The women could not stay at the rail yard. It was exposed unsafe with no facilities for proper care. A temporary camp had been set up 3 miles away in what used to be a German military barracks. The Wehrmacht had abandoned it during their retreat, leaving behind rows of empty beds, a working kitchen, a washroom with plumbing that still functioned. Now it served as a holding area for prisoners of war and displaced persons. A way station for the thousands of people caught in the chaos of Germany's collapse. People who had nowhere to go, no homes to return to, no families left alive. Trucks arrived to transport the women. They climbed aboard slowly, still weak, still adjusting to the reality that they were not going to be shot. Margaret was the last to board. She stood at the back of the truck, one hand on the metal frame, hesitating. Mitchell appeared beside her, offering his hand to help her up. She looked at his hand, looked at his face. This man who had freed her from chains, who had given her water, who had made sure she was fed. This enemy who had shown her more humanity in a few hours than her own government had shown her in years. She hesitated just for a moment. Then she took his hand. His hand was warm, calloused from hard work, strong from 3 years of war. He pulled her up effortlessly, steadying her as she found her balance in the truck bed. The physical contact lasted only seconds, but Margaret felt it down to her bones. The simple, undeniable humanity of another person helping her. No cruelty, no ulterior motive, just help. "Danke," she said quietly. "Thank you." Mitchell nodded. "You are welcome." The barracks was basic but functional. Rows of beds with actual mattresses, not straw pallets or cold ground. Real mattresses with springs and padding. Each bed had blankets, real wool blankets and pillows. Down the hall was a washroom with running water. The water was cold, yes, but it was running. It came from taps when you turned them. And there were toilets, actual toilets that flushed. After 5 days in that cattle car, it felt like luxury. It felt like a palace. Captain Bennett stood at the front of the barracks and addressed the women through a translator, a young corporal who spoke fluent German, whose grandparents had immigrated to Pennsylvania before the First War. "Each of you gets a bed," Bennett said. "We will bring dinner in a few hours. There is a washroom down the hall. Please clean up if you can. We will provide fresh clothes tomorrow." The women dispersed slowly. Some collapsed onto the mattresses immediately, not even removing their filthy clothes, just falling into sleep like drowning people finally reaching shore. Others headed straight for the washroom, desperate to feel clean again, to wash away the grime and the smell and the memory of those 5 days. Margaret chose a bed near the window. She sat on the edge, testing the mattress. It was firm, but comfortable. So different from the wooden floor of the cattle car, from the cold metal she had been chained to. She lay back slowly, her body not quite believing it was allowed to relax. She stared at the ceiling. For the first time in days, she felt something close to safe. But safety brought new fears. Questions she had not been able to afford while chained, while starving, while focused only on surviving the next hour. Now those questions flooded in. What happened to her family? Was her mother still alive? Her father? Her brother Gustav, conscripted at 16, sent to the Eastern Front and never heard from again. What was left of Germany? What was left of her hometown? Her life. Through the window she could see American soldiers moving about the camp, setting up equipment, talking in small groups. One of them was playing with a baseball, tossing it up and catching it, a mindless habit born from peacetime memories. Another was smoking a cigarette, staring at nothing. They looked tired, human, not like monsters at all. Days began to form a pattern. Wake at dawn with a bell. Roll call in the yard, not for military discipline, but for health checks to make sure everyone was accounted for, everyone was healing. Then, breakfast. That first breakfast changed something in Margaret's understanding of the world. She woke to the smell of coffee. Real coffee, not the ersatz substitute made from roasted grain that Germans had been drinking for years. The smell was rich, dark, almost overwhelming. It filled the barracks and pulled her out of sleep more effectively than any alarm. In the mess hall, soldiers were serving food: oatmeal with brown sugar, scrambled eggs, real eggs from real chickens, bread with butter, actual butter that was yellow and soft, and bacon. Margaret had never seen bacon like this. In Germany, meat had been rationed for years. What little they got was stringy, tough, more gristle than flesh. But this bacon was thick, crispy, glistening with fat. The smell of it cooking filled the entire building. Salty, rich, abundant. She took a piece, placed it on her plate next to the eggs and bread, sat down at one of the long tables, stared at the food in front of her. There was more on this single plate than she had eaten in the last week, maybe the last month. She picked up the bacon, took a bite. The taste exploded across her tongue. Salt and fat and smoke and something else, something she could not quite name. Prosperity, maybe. Abundance. The taste of a country that had so much it could afford to feed even its prisoners like this. She had forgotten what butter tasted like. Real butter. It melted on the warm bread, soaking in, making each bite soft and rich and perfect. Simple. Perfect. Around her, other women were having the same experience. Ingrid Fischer was crying as she ate, tears running down her face into her oatmeal. Clara Zimmermann ate slowly, mechanically, her face showing the conflict happening inside her head. Everything she had been taught said this should not be happening, that the enemy should not feed prisoners this well, that there had to be a trick. But there was no trick. There was just food. Hot. Plentiful. Given without strings attached. After breakfast there were work assignments. Light work, nothing strenuous. The Americans needed help sorting through captured German documents, translating things, organizing supplies. Women with medical training like Margaret were assigned to help in the camp infirmary. Margaret found herself working under Captain Bennett's direct supervision. The work was familiar, comforting in its routine, bandaging wounds, administering medicine, assisting with minor surgeries. The American medical supplies were far superior to what she had worked with on the Eastern Front. Clean, organized, abundant. "You are good at this," Bennett told her one afternoon, watching as Margaret expertly bandaged a soldier's leg wound. They communicated through a mix of simple English, basic German, and hand gestures. It was not perfect, but it worked. Margaret was picking up English words, quickly absorbing them through constant exposure, through necessity. "Thank you," Margaret said carefully in English. Bennett smiled. "Where did you train, Stuttgart?" Margaret said. Then, struggling with the words, "before war, hospital, civilian," she wanted to say more, wanted to explain how she had been conscripted, how she had not wanted to serve the Wehrmacht, how she had just been trying to survive. But the words would not come. Her English was not good enough yet. Bennett seemed to understand anyway. She nodded, squeezed Margaret's shoulder briefly, then moved on to check on another patient. The routine was strange but comforting. 3 meals a day, every day. Work that gave her purpose. A clean place to sleep. Hot water for washing, even if it was cold water, it was still clean water that came from taps instead of contaminated wells or bomb craters. These were basics, things any human being should have. But after years of war, after months of watching Germany collapse into chaos and starvation, they felt like incredible luxuries. One afternoon, Margaret was working in the infirmary when she heard sounds from outside. Laughter. Shouting. She went to the window and looked out. American soldiers were playing baseball in the yard. She had never seen baseball before. It made no sense to her. Why were they hitting a ball with a stick? Why were they running in circles? But their laughter was infectious. Their joy was real. These men who had been fighting and killing just days ago were playing a game like children. One soldier noticed her watching. He waved, just a simple gesture, friendly, open. Margaret hesitated, then waved back. Tentatively, carefully. It was such a small moment, but it showed that the walls were coming down, that she was beginning to see these men not as the enemy, not as monsters, but as people. People who liked to play games, people who smiled, people who waved at strangers in windows. Then the letters started arriving. Many of you watching lived through this era. Maybe your fathers served in the liberation of Europe. Maybe you remember the stories they told. If you have memories to share, please leave them in the comments. This generation's stories are fading, but they matter. They matter more than ever. The mail system was chaos. Most of Germany's infrastructure had been destroyed. Roads were cratered. rail lines twisted into useless metal, postal offices burned to the ground. But the Red Cross was working tirelessly to reconnect families, to bring some order to the ocean of displaced people washing across Europe. Millions of refugees, millions of soldiers, millions of civilians who had fled their homes and now desperately needed to know if anyone they loved was still alive. When a woman's name was called at mail distribution, everyone in the barracks held their breath. Would it be good news or bad news of survival or confirmation of death? In the spring of 1945, bad news was more common than good. 3 weeks after arriving at the camp, Margaret heard her name. Hartwell Margaret. Her heart stopped, then started again racing. She walked forward on legs that felt distant, disconnected. A corporal handed her a thin envelope. The paper was rough cheap, stained with dirt or water or both. The handwriting on the front was shaky, barely legible. But Margaret recognized it immediately. Her mother's handwriting. She took the letter back to her bed, sat down, held the envelope in both hands for a long time before opening it, because once she opened it, she would know. Whatever was inside, whatever truth it contained, would become real, and part of her was not ready for that reality. But she opened it anyway. The letter was brief, written on a scrap of paper that looked like it had been torn from a ledger book. The words were cramped, written small to save space to fit as much information as possible onto this single precious piece of paper. "My dearest Margaret," it began. "I write this not knowing if you are alive, not knowing if this letter will ever reach you, but I must try. I must believe that somewhere, somehow, you have survived. The bakery is gone. An air raid in February. The Americans, they say, though, it does not matter who dropped the bombs. The result is the same. Everything we built, everything your father worked for his entire life is rubble now. Your father is dead. He was in the bakery when the bombs fell. They say he did not suffer. They say it was quick. I do not know if this is true or if they tell me this to be kind. But he is gone. Gustav is missing. We received word 3 months ago that his unit was destroyed near Königsberg. No survivors listed, no bodies recovered. He is classified as missing, but we both know what that means. He is gone too. I am alive, but barely. The town is occupied by French troops now. They are not cruel, but they are not kind either. There is no food. People are eating grass, tree bark, anything they can find. I am living in the basement of what used to be the Hoffman house. You remember it, the big one on Kirchstrasse. 5 families share this space. We have 2 blankets between us and a single candle for light. If you are alive, if you are reading this, know that I love you. Know that I think of you every day. Know that I pray you have found safety somewhere. Your mother, Matilda. Margaret read the letter 3 times. Each time the words cut deeper. Her father, Conrad Hartwell, who had woken at 4 every morning to knead dough, who had taught her how to braid challah bread when she was 6 years old, who had smelled perpetually of flour and yeast and warmth, was dead. Gone. Erased by bombs that fell from the sky without warning, without mercy. Her brother Gustav, barely 17 years old, conscripted before he even finished school, sent to the Eastern Front, where boys were fed into the meat grinder of a losing war, was missing, which meant dead. Everyone knew what missing meant. And her mother, her strong, quiet mother, who had held the family together through years of rationing and fear and loss, was starving in a basement, sharing 2 blankets with strangers, eating grass to survive. Margaret looked around the barracks. Clean beds, warm blankets. Through the window she could see the mess hall, where in a few hours dinner would be served. Beef stew, probably. Potatoes. Bread. More food in one meal than her mother probably saw in a week, maybe a month. The guilt was crushing, physical. It pressed down on her chest like a weight, making it hard to breathe. She was safe, well fed, healthy. Her wounds were healing. She slept in a real bed. She had clean clothes. She had everything. And her mother was starving. Her father was dead. Her brother was dead. And here she was, comfortable in an enemy prison camp, eating bacon for breakfast while her family died. That night Margaret did not go to dinner. She could not. The thought of food turned her stomach. She lay on her bed, staring at the ceiling, the letter clutched in her hands. Around her, other women returned from the mess hall, talking quietly among themselves. Life went on. The world kept turning. But Margaret felt frozen, trapped in the moment of reading those words. Captain Bennet noticed her absence. She came to the barracks, found Margaret lying there in the growing darkness. "What is wrong?" Bennet asked, her voice soft with concern. Margaret could not speak. She just held out the letter. Bennet took it, read it slowly. Her German was limited, but she understood enough. She handed the letter back, her face sad. "I am sorry," Bennet said. "That is rough." She sat on the edge of Margaret's bed. This enemy officer, this woman who owed Margaret nothing and just sat there, offering silent presence, silent support. "My mother hungry," Margaret finally said, the English words clumsy on her tongue. "I eat. She no eat." Bennet nodded slowly, understanding the problem. "I know it does not seem fair," she said, "but you starving yourself will not help her. You need to stay strong. Maybe someday you can help her, but not if you are dead." The logic made sense. Intellectually, Margaret understood, but understanding did not make the guilt any easier to bear. Similar scenes were playing out across the camp. Women receiving letters from devastated families, cities in ruins, loved ones dead or missing, hunger, cold, desperation. The letters painted a picture of a Germany that had collapsed so completely that survival itself was a daily struggle. And yet here in this American prison camp, life was almost normal. 3 meals a day, medical care, shelter, safety. The contrast was impossible to reconcile. How could the enemy show more care for German prisoners than Germany had shown for its own people? The answer to that question came 1 month into their imprisonment. The Americans gathered all the women in the main hall. It was a large room, probably used for briefings when this had been a Wehrmacht barracks. Now it was empty except for rows of wooden chairs facing a white wall. A projector had been set up in the back, the kind used for training films. An American officer stood at the front of the room. He was older, maybe 50, with grey hair and a face that had seen too much. Through the translator he spoke clearly, his voice firm but not unkind. "We are going to show you something," he said. "Some of you may not want to see it, but we think you need to understand what your government did, what was done in your name." The women looked at each other nervously. What was this about Clara Zimmermann sitting near the front, her 19-year-old face still holding traces of the Hitler Youth propaganda she had believed so completely was suspicious. "It is propaganda," she whispered to the woman next to her. "Lies to justify their invasion." Margaret said nothing. She sat in the middle of the room, her hands folded in her lap, dread building in her chest. She did not know what they were about to see, but she knew it would be terrible. She could feel it in the air, in the grim set of the officer's face, in the way the American soldiers around the room looked anywhere except at the German women. The lights went out. The projector started clicking, that distinctive mechanical rhythm of film running through gears. Light appeared on the white wall. For the next hour they saw hell. Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald. The names meant nothing to Margaret at first, just German words, just places. But then the images began. Mountains of human corpses stacked like cordwood, thousands of them, tens of thousands. So many that the Allied soldiers who liberated these places had to use bulldozers to move them into mass graves because there was no other way to deal with that much death. Living skeletons stared at the camera. Men and women so thin that every bone in their bodies was visible through translucent skin. They weighed 60 pounds, maybe 70, but they were somehow still alive, still breathing. Children who looked like old people, gas chambers disguised as showers, crematoriums with bones still inside, barbed wire stretching in every direction, guard towers, electrified fences, piles of shoes, mountains of them, all sorted by size, organized, catalogued, human hair collected and baled, gold teeth extracted from corpses. The statistics appeared on screen. 6 million Jews murdered, millions more, Roma, disabled people, political prisoners, Soviet prisoners of war, anyone who did not fit, anyone who resisted, anyone who was different. The largest organized mass murder in human history. The footage also showed American and British soldiers forcing German civilians from nearby towns to walk through the camps to see what had been done. Women covered their mouths, vomiting on the ground. Men turned away, unable to look. But the soldiers made them look, made them see, and the camera kept rolling. The bodies kept appearing. The evidence kept mounting. In the dark hall, some German women looked away. Others cried. Ingrid Fischer fainted, her body simply giving up, unable to process what her eyes were showing her brain. 2 soldiers carried her out. Clara Zimmermann stared at the screen in shock. Her mouth hung open. Her hands gripped the edges of her chair so hard her knuckles turned white. Everything she had believed was crumbling. Margaret watched it all. Tears streamed down her face, but she could not look away. She felt she owed it to them, to those murdered millions, to bear witness. And as she watched, something broke inside her, because she had heard whispers. Everyone had heard whispers, about camps, about deportations, about disappearances. The Jewish families in her town, the Goldsteins and the Rosenthals and the Cohens families who had lived there for generations. One night they were gone, just gone, their houses empty, their shops boarded up, and Margaret had told herself it was not her problem. She was just a nurse. She just helped people. She was not responsible for what others did. She did not ask questions because asking questions was dangerous. But silence was complicity. Not acting was a choice. She had chosen not to see, chosen to look away. Chosen to focus on her own survival while all around her people were being murdered. It was easier to believe the propaganda, easier to accept what she was told without questioning, easier to convince herself that surely it could not be as bad as people said. But no one had done anything, and this was the result. When the lights came back on, the room was silent, absolute, crushing silence. Someone whispered in German, her voice barely audible. "Wir wussten es nicht." "We did not know." The American officer heard her. Through the translator he replied, his voice not angry, but firm, factual. "Maybe you did not. But someone knew. A lot of people knew. And now you know too. You can never say you did not know." The women filed out slowly. Nobody spoke. What could they say? The women who had still defended the Reich were quieter now. Some still claimed the footage was fake, but their voices were weaker now, less certain. That night the barracks was different. Women lay in their beds staring at ceilings or walls or nothing at all, processing, trying to understand. Margaret could not sleep. Every time she closed her eyes she saw the bodies, the living skeletons, the children. How had it happened? How had an entire nation allowed this, participated in this, built the infrastructure for this? And millions more like her had chosen not to see, had chosen not to ask questions, had chosen silence. When morning came, Margaret did something she had not done in weeks. She went looking for Sergeant Mitchell. She needed to talk to him, needed to ask him something, needed to understand how you live with knowledge like this. She found him sitting outside the infirmary on a wooden bench staring at nothing. He looked tired, older than his 28 years. The weight of war sat on his shoulders like a physical thing. You saw the film, he said when he saw her approach. It was not a question. He knew. Margaret nodded. She sat beside him on the bench, leaving a respectful distance between them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Margaret found the words, "How do you forgive after seeing that Mitchell was quiet for a long time?" Then he spoke his Alabama drawl, soft and slow. "I do not forgive what was done," he said. "I cannot. Nobody can." "But you—" He looked at her, his eyes meeting hers. "You are not responsible for that. You did not do it. You did not even know about it." "But I should have known," Margaret insisted. "I should have asked questions. I should have—" "You should have," Mitchell interrupted, his honesty surprising her. "Yes, but you did not. None of you did. And you cannot change that now." He paused. "What you can do is make sure it never happens again. Make sure you never stay silent again. That is the only way forward." Margaret felt something shift inside her. Not healing, not absolution, but understanding. She understood now why he had asked that first question back at the cattle car. "When did you last eat?" It had not been about intelligence gathering, had not been about establishing dominance or asserting power. It had been simple human compassion. He had seen a suffering person and wanted to help. That was the difference. That was what her government had lost. The ability to see enemies as human beings. The Americans had not lost that. Despite everything, despite all the death and destruction, they still saw people. "Why did you ask me?" Margaret said suddenly. "That first day, when you found me. Why did you ask when I ate?" Mitchell smiled slightly, a sad smile. "Because you looked hungry," he said simply. "And because everyone deserves to eat, even prisoners, even enemies. That is what makes us different." Margaret felt tears on her face again. But they were different this time. Not tears of grief or guilt, though those emotions were still there. But something else mixed in now. Hope, maybe. Or the beginning of healing. She had been taught to hate Americans, to fear them, to see them as barbaric monsters. But they had shown her more humanity than her own government ever had, and that truth would stay with her for the rest of her life. 6 months passed. Summer turned to autumn. The war in Europe had ended in May. Japan surrendered in August. The world was beginning the long, painful process of rebuilding. In the camp, preparations were being made for repatriation. Most German prisoners would be sent home once authorities determined they were not war criminals and had somewhere to go. Margaret's turn came on a grey November morning. She was called to the administration office and told that arrangements had been made. Her mother was still alive, still in that small town outside Stuttgart. Margaret could go home. She should have been happy. She had been dreaming of this moment for months. But instead she felt strangely empty, almost afraid. That evening she found Mitchell. He was off duty, sitting outside the headquarters building, smoking a cigarette. "I am leaving," she told him in English. Her accent was still thick, but her grammar had improved dramatically over the months. "They say I can go home next week." Mitchell nodded. "That is good. You must be relieved." "Yes," she said. Then more honestly, "No, I do not know." He gestured to the spot beside him. She sat down. "What is wrong?" he asked. She struggled to put it into words. "When I came here, I thought I knew who I was. German nurse, loyal to my country." But now she trailed off. "Now you do not know," Mitchell finished for her. "Everything I believed was wrong," she said. "Everything I was taught. Everything I thought I knew about the world. It was all lies, and I did not question it. I just accepted it. So do not accept things without questioning them anymore," Mitchell said. "That is what you learned here. That is what you take home with you." He paused. "Germany will need people like you, people who understand what went wrong and want to fix it." "I want to thank you," Margaret said, "for everything, for cutting me free, for treating me like a person, for she paused for asking when I last ate. Mitchell smiled. You do not have to thank me for basic decency. That should be the standard, not the exception. In my country, it became the exception, she said quietly. That is the problem. They sat in silence, watching the sun set over the camp. The journey home took 3 days. Margaret travelled with other repatriated prisoners, all of them nervous and uncertain. When they crossed into Germany through the American zone, the reality hit them. The destruction was beyond imagining. Cities that had once been proud and beautiful were now just rubble. Frankfurt, Stuttgart, Mannheim, all reduced to broken shells. People lived in the ruins, trying to rebuild with whatever they could find. When Margaret finally reached her hometown, she barely recognized it. The main street was gone. The church was a pile of stone. Her father's bakery was a crater. She found her mother in the basement she had mentioned in her letter. The woman who greeted her was thin, almost skeletal, her hair completely grey. She was only 48, but looked 70. Margaret, her mother, whispered as if she could not believe it. "Mama," Margaret said. And then they were holding each other, both crying. That night, as they sat in the cold basement sharing food Margaret had brought from the camp, her mother asked the question Margaret had been dreading. How were the Americans? Were they cruel? Margaret could have lied. It would have been easier, but she had promised herself. No more silence, no more looking away from truth. No, she said honestly. They were kind. They fed us, gave us medical care, treated us like people. Her mother was quiet for a long moment. Then we were told lies about that too, she said finally, along with everything else. Margaret stayed in her hometown, found work in a makeshift hospital, treating injured and sick civilians. Conditions were terrible. Limited supplies, no heat, not enough staff. But she did what she could. The skills she had learned in the American camp served her well. Years later, when Germany had begun to rebuild, when the worst of the hunger had passed, Margaret married a local schoolteacher named Ernst Weber. He was 32, had lost his left leg at the Battle of Kursk, now taught children in a rebuilt school. A quiet man, kind. He shared her determination to build a better Germany. They had 2 children, a daughter, Anna, born in 1948, a son, Thomas, born in 1950. She named him after Mitchell, though only she knew why. She told them stories about the war, about what had happened, about the lessons she had learned. Never stop questioning, she told them. Never accept cruelty as normal. Never dehumanize people, even your enemies. That is how it all went wrong. That is how good people did terrible things. Decades passed. Margaret became head nurse at the regional hospital. She trained younger nurses, emphasizing compassion, human dignity in medical care. She never forgot what the Americans had taught her. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the war's end, the local historical society asked Margaret, now 73, to speak at a commemoration. She was reluctant at first, but her husband encouraged her. "People need to hear this," he said. She stood before a crowd of hundreds and told her story. "I want to tell you about a question that changed my life," she began. April 17th, 1945. I had been chained in a cattle car for 5 days. No food, no water, by my own people, for the crime of speaking truth. When American soldiers opened that door, I expected cruelty. That is what we had been taught. But Staff Sergeant Thomas Mitchell did something I never expected. He set down his rifle. He crouched to my level, and he asked, "When did you last eat? Not who are you? Not where are your commanders? Just concern for my basic welfare." That question broke me, not with pain, but with kindness. Because you see, I had been taught that Americans were monsters, but instead They fed us, gave us medical care, treated us like human beings, and that was harder to accept than any cruelty would have been, because it meant everything we had believed was a lie. I tell you this not to make you feel guilty. This is not your sin, but it is your responsibility to remember, to question, to never accept cruelty as normal, to never dehumanize people, even your enemies, because that is how it starts. They stop seeing other people as human. I was silent. I accepted. I did not question. And I have to live with that. But you do not have to make the same mistakes. You can be like Thomas Mitchell. You can choose compassion over cruelty. You can ask the right questions. Not who is my enemy, but when did you last eat? After the speech, a young woman, maybe 20, approached Margaret. Did you ever find him? The sergeant. Margaret shook her head. No, but I named my son after him, and I have lived my life trying to honor what he taught me. What would you say to him if you could? The young woman asked. Margaret smiled. I would say thank you, not just for freeing me from chains, but for freeing me from hatred, from propaganda, from lies. Thank you for showing me that humanity transcends nationality, that we are all just people, and we all deserve to be asked, when did you last eat? 8 years later, in 2003, Margaret Rose Hartwell Weber passed away peacefully in a hospital bed surrounded by her children and grandchildren. She was 81 years old. Her son Thomas, now 53, a successful doctor, gave the eulogy at her funeral. My mother lived through the darkest moment in human history, he said. She saw the worst of what people can do to each other, but she also saw the best. She saw that even in darkness there is light. Even in cruelty there is kindness. Even in war there is humanity. She was named after a flower, Rose, and like a rose she grew through concrete, through rubble, through ash. And she bloomed. She taught us all that the most powerful question is not who is my enemy, it is when did you last eat? It is how can I help? It is how can I show compassion? That was her gift to us, and now we pass it on. Her gravestone was simple, elegant. Margaret Rose Hartwell Weber, 1922 to 2003. Kindness breaks all chains. Flowers were placed at the base, fresh. Someone still remembered. The war ended. The prisoners went home. Life moved on. But the lesson remained. In our darkest moments, what we choose to ask each other, how we choose to treat each other, can change everything. A German nurse chained in a cattle car, an American sergeant who asked about her well-being instead of her sins, and a simple act of human decency that proved more powerful than years of propaganda. That is the story worth remembering, not because it makes us feel good, but because it reminds us what we are capable of, both the worst and the best. The choice is always ours. What question will you ask today? If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more untold stories from history that remind us of our shared humanity. Leave a comment below telling us what this story means to you. And remember, in a world that tries to divide us, kindness is always the answer. Because as Margaret learned in that frozen cattle car 79 years ago, sometimes the most powerful weapon is not a gun or a bomb. It is 3 simple words. When did you last eat?